Voice of the Cape Drive Time, welcome back to the show. 072-238-0712 is the WhatsApp number. Feel free to query, comment, stroke and or criticize. The Australian man responsible for a massacre of Muslim worshippers last Friday in New Zealand has been described as an extremist right-wing person and a violent terrorist. During his court appearance, he expressed admiration for other violent white nationalists, also giving a white nationalist sign to the media. Online is sociologist at Rice University, specializing on anti-racism and religious pluralism, Dr. Craig Considine. Dr. Considine, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shafiq.
You've picked up on something which I find very interesting, and in our South African environment certainly enjoys a lot of currency: racial grammar. And if one investigates, it kind of says that something can be historically black but not historically white, and that this racial grammar is like smog in the air. You can see it, but you can't. Tell us more.
Well, this is a very good point, Shafiq. And what we're seeing with the term terrorism itself, it's quite literally being racialized. So when a white supremacist and a white nationalist carries out a crime, there's a tendency among media outlets to not immediately define it with what it is, which is the term, rightly so, terrorism. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, let's say an Arab who happened to be brown and had a beard, if he carried out a similar attack, I think a lot of people are recognizing now that the media would immediately define that as terrorism. So what we're seeing is a double standard. And the term terrorist itself has become racialized, just as Muslims have been racialized themselves.
Yeah, so could one say that is probably the most obvious example of what this theorist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, that you've been using in some of your courses in the university, would describe as racial grammar, in a sense?
Yes, absolutely. And we see it outside of the realm of just Muslims as well. So in the U.S. context, and it might be similar in South Africa, we might have an African-American man in an urban environment carrying out a crime. And again, the media immediately jumps, and the public jumps on a term like a thug or a gang member. Now, when similar crimes are carried out by non-people of color, let's take just white people, for instance, there's other terms, things like lone wolf or random act of violence, or this person had mental health issues. So again, Bonilla Silva is saying that we've kind of been programmed to use certain terms when certain people carry out certain crimes or acts of violence. And he literally says we've been programmed to think as such. So he's making a very, very valid point, and it's always applicable to things like what happened in Christchurch.
In fact, mentioning Christchurch, I think, is obviously it's the current event, but are you getting the feeling that Christchurch might be a watershed event, and that I'm beginning to suspect that the grammar is beginning to change because of Christchurch, because it was so in the face of everybody watching it, particularly because it's streamed live on Facebook? The grammar has been sort of wiped away by the winds of truth, in a sense. One cannot now hide behind racial grammar because everybody saw exactly what happened.
That's an excellent point, Shafiq. And I'm actually in New York City now, and yesterday we were at an interfaith vigil at the Jamaica Muslim Center in Queens, New York. And a lot of religious leaders, we had rabbis, Muslims, priests, people of all religious faiths, and they said the same thing that you just said, that we actually might be at the tipping point now because these white supremacist acts of terror are happening with more frequency, and we're starting to get to that kind of watershed moment. And in the United States, I'll tell you, a lot of Jews are coming to the side of Muslims because of what happened at the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting recently, which, again, same type of murderer, same type of terrorist going into a place of worship simply because he had hate. And the media described it then, that is an act of terror. And then when we keep seeing them over and over again, eventually the people will demand that the media call it what it is. And I think our challenge is to get politicians and public officials to get on this kind of bandwagon that we're now seeing in the media. Like, we saw Donald Trump actually did not even declare white supremacy to be an issue. He said it's actually a very small thing, which is factually inaccurate, Shafiq. It's factually inaccurate. And it can be tested. I wrote about this in my book, Muslims in America Examining the Facts. I had a whole chapter on, over the last decade or so, who is committing the most violent crimes that might be defined as terrorism in the United States. And it's white supremacists. It's a consistent thread. So let's hope that we're getting to a point where this racial grammar kind of becomes obsolete and it becomes irrelevant, and we can just call a spade a spade. Just define what it is, describe it as it is. It's an act of terror.
Do you think that part of the problem of racial grammar does lie in political leadership, which can at times be extremely mischievous? I think Donald Trump is an example that we can use, because if you look at his tweets, and I think there isn't anybody who doesn't look at his tweets, when it comes to these issues, he is very good at doing a sidestep. And he avoids the grammar that should be used, and he always reverts to the grammar that is always being used. And this is becoming quite a trend. And if you look at some of the other right-wing leaders in the world, the same thing appears in their media statements, their speeches, their Twitter accounts, when we see something like this, that they are resorting to the old racial grammar, but it's becoming more and more obvious.
It is, and I think what a lot of the far right on the political spectrum across the world, not just in the United States and let's call it the Western world, like what we're seeing, even in Donald Trump, he is engaging in a very, very problematic trend, which is when white supremacists carry out acts of murder or violence or terror, he sends his thoughts and condolences to the New Zealand government, but he doesn't send any condolences to Muslims, and he doesn't call the terrorist a white supremacist. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if a Muslim carried out an act of violence, Donald Trump would immediately go to Twitter and say, we have a problem with radical Islamic terrorism. So he only racializes it, and he only uses particular terms when Muslims are the perpetrators. When Muslims are the victims, he just says thoughts and prayers, we're with you. So he's just playing to his base. Going back to your point about these politicians on the far right, they're just playing to their base. They're pampering to their base, because if Donald Trump uses a term like white supremacy or white supremacist terrorist, most of his followers will start thinking, wait a minute, I'm white. And a lot of these people might get the same dose that a lot of Muslims around the world get. They kind of get lumped into this monolithic entity where you're part of a larger group that is deemed to be suspicious or potentially violent.
How do the students react when you teach a course on something like racial grammar, where young people start to realize that the frames of reference that they've used all their lives is a problem, to put it quite bluntly? I mean, your lecture theatre must be quite interesting at times.
It is indeed, and they get it. I'm at Rice University, brilliant students there, and what we do, Shafiq, I'll print out or I'll pull up 3 news articles. Let's call it relating to an act of terrorism. So the one that I always use, or an act of violence, the ones I use are James Holmes, who carried out a mass shooting event in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and then I use Michael Brown, who was the young African-American man that was killed by police officers in Ferguson. And we go through these articles from the same news outlets, and the students recognize that white people who carry out these crimes are humanized. They're described as, loners, or like, they were smart when they were younger and they were caring and they were just kind of isolated. But then when you jump over to the Michael Brown article, it's focusing on things like, he was listening to hip hop, he's listening to rap, he smoked a little marijuana, and, he sagged his pants. So it's what we see with the media. It's kind of a self-serving description. It's a self-serving prophecy. They're trying to depict certain people in certain narratives to either humanize or to demonize. And oftentimes the white people get an unnecessary amount of humanity in their character descriptions by media outlets.
In fact, there was an English newspaper talking about this latest Australian terrorist, saying that he was sweet when he was young, and there's a picture on the front page of the newspaper. I'm sure you've seen it, which it kind of like, it really hits you between the eyes when you see it from a distance, and you think, but hang on a minute, this guy just walked into a place of worship, and it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. I mean, the fact it's a place of worship, whether it's a mosque, a temple, a church, or whatever, and shot down people in cold blood. And here, mainstream media is trying to say he was an angel previously. It really doesn't add up, does it?
No, it's, I think for someone that actually studies it, it's getting to a point where it's obviously tragic, because all of these misconstrued narratives do a lot of damage, but it's also almost comical at this point to call a mass murdering terrorist white supremacist with the word angel somehow leads us to believe that something just went wrong in his life. He took a bad turn, and it just happened. Where if it happened to Muslims, it's rooted in the Quran. Islamophobes are going to go to a Quran and pick up a verse that will highlight the reason why that they committed their act. So it's unfortunate, it's comical, and I'm a big proponent of free speech, Shafiq, but I also think these media outlets really do need to start being held accountable for their destructive narratives. It is leading to violence. Words do matter, images do matter, and politicians need to find a way. They have a moral responsibility to clean up a lot of this. It's propaganda in a lot of ways.
No, absolutely. And on social media, I saw an impassioned address by a television presenter, a YouTube video, questioning Facebook and saying, the owners of Facebook, you guys have made a lot of money, you're sitting comfortably in your homes, where's your conscience? This event was streamed live on Facebook. What are you going to do? You pay people so badly to police your website, and now this happens. Where's your conscience? It does open questions, doesn't it, in terms of that? I mean, I don't have the answers, but I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, and to be honest with you as well, I'm not sure I have the answers to this either, because, again, you got to be very careful with free speech issues, and
absolutely,
you don't want to start becoming, censorship police officers, and you can't say this or you can't say that. But at the same time, there needs to be a cleansing, in a way, of some of these white supremacist, openly white supremacist Facebook profiles and Twitter groups, and you have boards like Reddit and all of these other kind of far right-wing websites. And this is how these people become radicalized or further radicalized, because they find these online communities, can't find more people out in the real world that necessarily think like them, so they go online. And that's where their little safe space, and they live in their little echo chamber, and they get all the material that they need to feel good about their narratives. And it's destructive. It's absolutely destructive. So something needs to happen. I do see Twitter is kind of taking steps here and there. I think we hear some stuff with Milo Yiannopoulos. I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but he's kind of a far-right provocateur. And, people are starting to realize that, his social media accounts are just absolutely destructive. And same with Tommy Robinson in the UK. Just goes online and spews ridiculous nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, and it's destructive. So we do see some action being taken, but this idea of live streaming, that was unprecedented. It was brutal.
Oh, boy, yes.
After 10 seconds, I was just like, I'm not bringing my body and soul into that dark place, because that's what that murderer wanted, you know? He wanted to lure us into this dark world, and you can't give him oxygen. You can't give him the time of the day to do that.
Sometimes, and I've been in the media for a while, sometimes I'm starting to think, I don't know whether it's wisdom or desperation in having to deal with these issues all the time, because it gets quite depressing, that sometimes these people are best served by the silence of being ignored. I mean, I don't know whether there's anything sane in what I'm saying, but the thought does cross my mind from time to time.
Yeah, and you know, I was speaking with some Muslim leaders about this yesterday, and some of the most frequent words that we see in the Islamic holy book are mercy and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to these individuals who are...
It looks like we've...
No, these are people that are suffering.
No, it is true. And I suppose, Dr. Considine, at the end of the day, as a human being, it's a question of how we balance our feelings of compassion with justice, I suppose.
Yes, I think that is like with everything in life, it's got to be a balance. You know, like we always have to try to reach people to get to that point where we can understand our common humanity. But at the end of the day, to be honest, I think some people are lost, and unfortunately, there may be no bringing them back to the light.
Unfortunately, Dr. Craig Considine, unfortunately we have to leave it there. Sociologist at Rice University, specializing on anti-racism and religious pluralism. If you just Google Dr. Craig Considine's name, his books and his publications and the good work that he does will pop up. But Dr. Craig Considine, thanks for chatting to us about a very interesting called racial grammar in light of what happened in New Zealand. Carry on with the good work.
Bye-bye.